So thank you everyone for joining us so far as you're trickling into the meeting. You'll see where we're starting at the moment on the screen. Of course, we just want to thank some of the sponsors for M365 May, and of course the M365 May team who have put all of this together. Laurie, if we just jump on to the next slide.
You got that?
Thank you. So first of all, as well, we just want to acknowledge the traditional custodians on the land on which this online conference is hosted, and the traditional custodians of the lands where our Australian-based speakers and participants are located. And we'd also just like to pay our respects to elders past, present and future. And on behalf of M365 May, we'd also like to welcome and acknowledge all of our speakers and participants from Aotearoa, New Zealand, and thank you for supporting this hui. Next slide, please. And of course, just a few quick housekeeping things. Just want to take the opportunity to share the code of conduct for M365 May. Of course, the main point here is to be constructive, respectful, helpful and kind. And of course, this conference is dedicated to providing a harassment-free environment for everyone. We won't tolerate harassment in any form from any participants, and if any participants do violate these rules, you'll be removed from the conference. But I trust we won't see anything like this throughout the month of May. So thank you for being respectful. So I guess we'll kick on now with some of the content that we have ready for you today. So for those who haven't heard of SWOOP before, we provide self-serve real-time analytics dashboards to help drive increased collaboration in organizations. So we like to think of it as sort of like your own personal Fitbit for collaboration on tools like Microsoft Teams and Yammer. And of course, we help organizations get better and faster at collaborating. And we know that organizations at the moment, they are relying heavily and investing heavily into these tools now more than ever, of course, to drive increased cross-organizational collaboration. And we also help organizations to understand what good looks like on Teams and Yammer, and that's all also done by the SWOOP dashboard, as well as through some of our benchmarking reports, which we are going to be chatting through today. So for today's session, we've recently released the world's first benchmarking study of Microsoft Teams, and we're going to share with you today some of the findings as a part of that report, as well as some of the worst practice examples that we found. But of course, we want to balance that out with some of the good. So we'll also be sharing with you a best practice case study example from one of our fantastic SWOOP customers. So joining me today on the call from SWOOP, we have our Chief Data Scientist, Dr. Lawrence Lockley, who has really crunched the numbers to show us a very clear picture of how Teams is being adopted across organizations, of course, by looking at the analytics. And then I am also joined by Sharon Dawson, who is SWOOP's Director of External Relations and Communication. And Sharon will be sharing some of the key details of the case study example that I just mentioned earlier. So in saying that, I'm going to hand over to Laurie to kick off our presentation for today.
Oh, thank you, Emily. Just to give you a little bit of background beyond about SWOOP, because I guess we've been going for about 5 years now, but our core science is something called social network analysis. Sometimes that's referred to as organizational network analysis. This is something that my co-founder and I, Kai Kerr, sort of had been doing projects on probably for the last decade or more, and for myself, even beyond that, probably for the last 20 years. So organizational network analysis and relationship analytics is pretty much in our DNA, in our blood, and that's what you're seeing in SWOOP. When we started collecting sort of data from Yammer initially, and then we moved on to other tools, including Teams, we started to realize that we could actually, because we don't actually take content, if you like, we don't actually look at people's messages and we don't look at people's names or anything like that, it's all metadata. We could actually look at this data and just look at the patterns, and from those patterns we could actually compare organizations, but also we could compare teams within organizations, a single organization, or groups within a single organization. So I think we've now done 5 Yammer benchmarks. We've done a couple with Workplace by Facebook, and this is our first with Teams. And We didn't have as many organisations in the teams benchmarking. We had 15 in total. In Yammer, we're well over the 100 mark now, but we did analyse down to the teams level. So we had over 5,000 teams that we actually analysed. So that's a good number in anyone's language. You know, as far as I can tell, the research I've done, the biggest other study had about less than 200, and I think that was a Google study. So so we think we've got quite a lot of quality data to look at. I think that's something that's unique for us at SWOOP. As I said, let me go straight into the first slide about the benchmarking report. And I guess we summed it up by saying when we look at teams from a network perspective, what we're actually seeing is 3 different social networks. You know, so we're seeing a social network forming around chat. We're seeing a social network forming around meetings, which is pretty much aligned with the formal organisation because that's sort of where most of our meetings are sort of drawn from. And we're seeing another important, I think, if not the most important cluster around the teams themselves and the teams channels. And when we looked at the sort of way people were adopting, now I should say that this data, I think, was from November 2019 back 12 weeks. Right? So we had nearly 3 months worth of data from about that period. And we wrote the report in January. So, so of course, you know, the world has changed since then. So the adoption, you know, the way I thought about it this morning is that, you know, we were sort of watching the adoption rate of teams in this data of late 2019. It's nearly like someone's turned the dial from 1.5 up to 100 or something in the last month. So so this is a very dynamic time for teams, and we'll talk about that a little bit about that later. But nevertheless, what we're seeing is people coming into the teams environment tend to sort of come from their space in Office 365 outside of the teams environment. So if they were used to using Skype and Outlook meetings and so forth, they tend to come into the teams environment and just use those functions, mainly use those functions. If you came from a team working in the Yammer environment or a team working in the SharePoint environment, you more naturally came into the sort of team channel space. It's not to say you wouldn't use chat, of course they do, but nevertheless, most of the important interactions were happening in the team channel space. So what we're really seeing is what we're calling new immigrants coming in. We often in the report, I think we refer to it as the digital Ellis Island, if you like, where people are coming in with the hope that they're going to do this wonderful new stuff, but they start by basically just doing what they were doing in their other tools. And that's pretty much what the status quo was at the time that we wrote the report. I keep saying was because so much has happened in the last month, but nevertheless, this is what's happening. Yeah, so in terms of message volume, you know, a lot of it, if we're just counting messages, most of it is in chat, you know, because that's the easiest thing to come in and start doing. So we see a lot of people coming in and doing that. But as you know, with chat, it's very ephemeral, sort of, you know, to and froing, if you like. Most people are saying this is just little chit chat about us doing our daily thing. It could be about anything. A lot of the people we talk to said that the important discussions are actually in the team channels, and that's the place where SWOOP has sort of concentrated. This is where we concentrate our focus on how people are interacting in the teams dynamic. In the report, we do talk about the volume of chat, but largely that's all we talk about. You can get that data pretty much from the basic Teams admin panels anyway, but we do provide that as well. But we're consistently told that the important stuff happens in the team channel space because that's where the persistence is. That's where we store stuff. That's where when we do stuff, we keep it there. And you can see we've got this whole beehive analogy running here because the way I like to think about it is that when you're in chat, you're actually out there doing your work, if you like, but it's mainly chit chat and organising each other and saying, is this done or have you done this yet or what have you. But when you're actually wanting to sort of share that with the rest of your teams and even beyond your teams, this is when you're in your team's channel space, you know. So it's like coming back to the hive to start storing your stuff and to start living the team, if you like. The meetings can run obviously inside team channels, but largely we see people using that just independently, again, just as another sort of network, but we often see that meetings are pretty much related to what happens in your business as usual formal structures, and they tend to be run as you've always run them, but now digitally. So so that's what we're sort of seeing at this point in time. I think it's still the way it is even now. Now, it doesn't take long to realise that a team in Teams, and we call it capital T teams, being Teams the product, aren't really teams as we would generally sort of understand them, right? So when we think about our work team, we often think about the people we're dealing with every day. We might interact with them each day, at least once a week, if you like. And that number usually is a lot smaller than that. Typically, 4 to 6 people is seen as an optimum team size. Anything over 10, the research tells us your productivity starts to drop. Now, when we look at teams in the Teams product, we can only find about 20% of the teams fit that sort of profile, right? So, in fact, most of the teams, 60% of the teams, we actually have labelled disconnected or hardly active at all. Now, that's because I think it's been very experimental the way people have come into teams. So they're starting teams. It hasn't been governed early on because it's been introduced as a pilot and people are allowed to go on, and often it's just the IT groups. So there's a lot of, if you like, fairly inactive teams there. But the ones that are really, what we do find is some are very active and very engaged. So we're very interested in that 40%, if you like. And when we looked at that 40% and we ran the sort of statistics over them, we found that there was 4 different clusters, if you like, of groupings. And the way we've labelled them, you can see them on the right-hand side. You can see that we've labelled them as either single leader teams, which we're probably most familiar with in our normal face-to-face work, self-directed teams, which is often the aspirational sort of team type. And actually the team type that today I think we're starting to see merge now, because it's much harder to run a single leader team when you're all sitting at home working virtually. So that's our aspirational type, and that was 13% of all the teams. And then we saw forums, which are basically just big groups of people where there's just a few people talking. So it's very much like a publishing sort of space. A little bit of Q&A, but mainly just sort of sending out messages, if you like, or sharing information to a big broader group. And I think the largest team we had probably had over 4,000 people in it. So that's clearly not a normal team as we'd see it. And then there's 8% that we would characterise as communities. Now, the communities, the way we see them differ to forums, often they're a little bit smaller, but they still have a fairly big gallery, if you like, of inactive people. But in this case, there's a self-directing core. And typically when we see communities or communities of practice, there's a core group that tend to share the facilitation of the community. And then the rest of the people are basically there watching and learning and listening and so forth. So we've characterised those as communities. Now, you might say, well, shouldn't they be in Yammer? Well, that's a good question that we're going to address a little bit later. So let's continue on from there. Now, this is just a quick summary of the main findings. Now, first of all, as I said, because of the difference in how people were coming in, whether they're just experimenting or they're really getting in there and using it heavily, there's a big gap between the best and the worst, right? So the average is sort of very much down in the lower end, if you like, because there's some very high performing teams and a big lot of teams that are really just mucking around and just experimenting. But in that top tier, we found some exceptional teams, right? Not just self-directed teams, but single leader teams. We saw some exceptional communities as well. So yes, there's some very good examples even now in the samples that we're seeing. Staff on average were members of 3 teams. Now, in your face-to-face work, I doubt that many people are members of more than 1 or 2 teams. In the digital space, some people were members of hundreds of teams. So first of all, you'd say, well, how can that be? What can they do being members of hundreds of teams? Well, that's, I think, a very open question. In my own mind, I think you can certainly be members of other teams if they're forums or communities, but it's very hard to be a member of more than even 2 self-directed teams or single leader teams. Teams is being promoted as a hub, a place where you bring your work to. This is sort of what Microsoft is positioning Teams as And that's a question a lot of our clients have been asking, you know, how much is Teams actually being used as a hub? So we measured that. We had a look at it and we found that 70% of the teams had actually added tabs to the default tab, right? So they're starting to customize their workplace. Now, what were in those added applications? Well, the most popular one was a little bit of a surprise for us, was Excel, in fact. So Excel was by far the largest added tab. And the next most popular, which had about half the popularity, were SharePoint and Planner. Now, the other thing is that, let's see, that last point, Teams is used to collaborate within business units. I guess the other, yeah, I think we'll talk about that a little bit later, but largely we were seeing that often the team collaboration was happening inside the formal business unit more so than between them, but I have another slide about that later, so we can go through it there. Now, when we do benchmarking, what we're really looking for is best practices or exceptional cases, or the teams that are performing at the top. And the reason we do this is obvious, because this is all about knowledge sharing. So if people are performing well, we want to know, you know, what are they doing that seems to be working, and we want to share that with the rest of the organisation and bring the rest of the organisation up to that level. So it's a simple sort of, this is a simple premise of benchmarking. Now, so what we did is we looked at what we saw using our analytics, which, as I said, it's pretty much context free. It just gives us the connection sort of data. And then we went back to our customers and said, here's an ID for a team. By our determination, they're very high performing. We'd like to know what they're doing, you know, and what is it that's special about what they're doing. So we got this sort of feedback from our customers, and then we started to classify them into best use case types or clusters, if you like. And I'll just go through those now. So these are the four main ones that we came up with. All right. So the first one was where there was a context where there needed to be what we're calling around the clock and around the globe monitoring or surveillance. You know, whether that's surveillance for security or for privacy or whatever, it didn't sort of really matter. It's just that there was a number of teams, and I think our most active team had about 25 members. Remember I said anything more than 10, you would lose your productivity. In this case, they had more than double that, but they were an extremely active team. And because of their context of surveillance around the globe, you know, they were actually posting messages on average each 14 minutes, I think, of the day. You know, so every individual is posting every 14 minutes of the day. And you can understand why that's important, because when they go to sleep, somebody else comes in, they've got to take over. So they need to read what's happening so they can keep the thread going. So and there was more than one of those sorts of use cases. So we could see that was a very, very, very high powered one for teams. The next one was where there was a situation where you have an onshore and an offshore team. So a lot of our customers have outsourced work, or they have work done in not their home country, if you like. And it's often the case that the resources that the offshore team have available to them aren't as rich as the ones that the onshore team have. And sometimes they just want to spread their work around the clock, if you like, too. And that's another reason why they offshore. But nevertheless, there's a need to connect the onshore and offshore teams, and they need to connect them quite closely. So we saw a number of examples where there was this need for an onshore-offshore connection within the team. And I think one of our examples is actually going to talk to that, that Sharon will go through later. Global change programs. In fact, Office 365 and our Microsoft 365 is actually an example of that, but it could be any sort of change program. And in fact, I'm sure most organizations are going through a change program right now. But when you're going through a change program that needs to engage the whole organization, this is where something like not just Teams, but even Yammer come into their own, because this is a way that you can start to reach right down to the working level, right up to the executive level. And we saw some global change programs happening there that we could identify as high performing. And the final one was mainly with organizations that were running projects with clients. And when they were running projects with clients, they were actually running external teams in their team's client. So in that way, they can connect their team that's actually on site with the customer with the rest of their organization. And this is, I know that I've worked for consulting companies before, and we always used to say, when you hire us, you hire the whole company. You know, well, that wasn't always strictly the case, but you can see that when you've got a team there and you've got some extended team members actually not on site, you know, they can be more actively involved. And also a project team inside the client organization could also invite other members into that team, so they could feel like they were participating in this team, you know, as a, you know, much more closely than they would have before. And that's another strong use case. Now, I know with a lot of large organizations, the external teams feature has been turned off, and we think that needs to be challenged a little bit, you know, saying, well, look, you know, maybe in some cases the benefit is more than the cost, so, or the risk in this case. So, but we'll get to that in our best and worst practices. So, of course, you'll have the opportunity to download the report. I think Emily will have a Q code to look at that later on. Now, let me move on to, this is the sort of interesting part for a lot, because when we started out with the report, our reports typically have numbers, and that's the sort of stuff that I do. But we also have stories, you know, and this is what Sharon does. So when we identify high-performing organizations or groups or teams, you know, this is where we make contact with our customers, and Sharon goes in and starts to sort of talk to them about what is it that this team's doing, what is their context, what can we share, not just within your organization, but with the broader world about what is really working in this space. And this is, it's very colourful, you know, it's more interesting to read than the numbers that I produce, I'd have to say, but so that's why we do it. But in this case, we thought it'd be more interesting to say, well, we do say what best practices are, and sometimes when you read a lot of these best practices, they sound a bit motherhoodish, and we thought, well, why don't we get some of our partners that are working with these teams on a day-to-day basis, helping them adopt the tools and use the tools more effectively? Why don't we ask them what they've seen that they consider a worst practice? So things that potentially, if it continues, could be very hard to wind back in the future and could cause damage to the whole adoption process. And these are the sort of, I think we've got 5 sort of key themes. There was quite a lot there, but we've clustered them up into 5 things. The first 2, I must say, are taking aim at the IT department. Now, in some ways, that's a little bit unfair because they're like the default owners, and all they're doing is what they know. But what we're saying is that if Teams is sort of rolled out by the IT department in the way that they've rolled out other enterprise software, they're going to run into trouble. And typically that's because it's over formalized. So basically it's, you know, the typical department by department, make sure everybody's been trained in the functions before they put their hands on the application, all this sort of stuff. It's over structured, and what they've found is that people just run out of steam, and even the training isn't effective because it's context free. It's just training on, it's not on how you use it as in your team. So that was a key one that came out. In terms of structuring a team, now one of the common questions that come up is what is a team? How should we form a team in teams? And, you know, typically if you ask the IT department, they will say, well, if you make your team the same as your business as usual team or your face-to-face team, then that'll make things pretty easy for us because we've got the directory and we've got where you are in the organization, so it'll all match up and it'll be nice and easy. Well, you know, our consultants are saying this underplays teams tremendously. Now, we're not saying it's necessarily a bad thing, and I'll talk to that in a coming slide, but it does sort of limit the potential that you can get from the Teams product. So, and that was fairly universal. So, and that the third point is basically related to that above point as well. This, you know, the easy thing is just make the teams the same as you've got in your current status quo. The fourth one is about thinking that, you know, if you get your senior executives on board, then everybody will jump on board as well. This is the story that we tell in Yammer, and it works very well because if the senior executives get on and they're starting to use the Yammer, then people say, well, if they're using it, I should use it. This doesn't work that way with Teams, you know, and what we heard from our partners is that the best way to introduce Teams is to have operating people using the software and then sharing their good experiences and their bad experiences so that the rest of the people that follow them can start running, right? Can start with running. So it's very much a workplace up sort of situation rather than the other way down. The last one is the one that I call the Thermomix argument, that if you buy this tool, you can get rid of all the other tools you had to use, and that makes your life much simpler. So if you use Teams, then you don't need Yammer, you don't need SharePoint, you don't need OneNote. You just use Teams and it all happens in there. Well, this is sort of not a good thing to do, because in fact Teams is not a replacement. It's a hub to draw those other applications in. And if you decide to not use those others, you're actually limiting your capability and what you might be able to do. So of course in the report, you can see the reverse of those and what they should be doing, and some of it stands out pretty well anyway. So just a little poll I think that Emily's going to run. So thinking about those worst practices, I'll put them back up. Which ones do you see that your organisation's actually doing? So let's let that run for a few minutes.
You just have to pop your answers in the chat. We did have a poll running, but unfortunately it's not working for us right now. So maybe you could put even 1, 2, 3, or 5, depending on what's showing on the screen. Got a few answers coming through. 3. We've got a few 3s, a few 5s, a small portion of 1 with a side of 2.
Yeah, I know we beat up on IT quite a lot, but to be fair, they haven't asked to be the leaders of the team rollout. Most of them are just doing it because there's nobody else putting their hand up. So I think if you're not an IT person and you feel passionate about Teams, stick your hand up and take some leadership, because the IT department don't even profess to know what they should be doing necessarily. I mean, they can govern the resource usage, and I think that's what they do well. But other than that, I think Teams are certainly related to functions that should be turned on or turned off, or basically left on. I think that's a big thing that the discussion you should be having with them. Will I move on, Emily, or?
Yeah, there seems to be just quite an even mix of all of them, actually, just in some of the answers coming through in the chat. Yeah, so maybe we'll jump onto, I think the next, we have another question for everyone as well.
Yeah, so the next one,
yeah.
Which, so I guess, it's a new world now, and that new world started around the March period. Some of you it was late February, some of you maybe not even into April, but I guess that nearly everybody on the call here is working from home. How much of a lift do you think happened with Microsoft Teams between, say, February and March? What percentage would you guess?
We've got a few answers coming through.
And just to clarify, this was from our SWOOP's research using our customers,
yes.
not Microsoft's.
You would have seen Microsoft publishing percentages of activity, I guess, so that probably gives you a hint anyway. But what we've measured is our benchmarking sort of organisations, and how much their activity on average has lifted between February and March. In fact, it was March going into the first week of April. So, okay.
Some of the answers we've got here, some of the guesses are 600%, 300%, 70%, 150%, 1,000%.
Could be anything, couldn't it?
Some of them have just rolled out, so they're not too sure just yet.
Yeah. All we know is that, well, let me, on average for us, 210% increase in activity on Microsoft Teams, and about a 70% rise in Yammer in March, right? So from February to March, that was the thing. Now the chart below, you might have to stare at a little bit, but basically what we've got here is, read it myself, is we've got a number of dimensions that were measured from these this sample from both Yammer and for Teams. And what you're looking at is 6 dimensions that SWOOP measures. So the number of users, the percentage of participation, that means the percentage of people using Teams as a percentage of those that are eligible to use it, they have a license to use it. That's what we call our participation measure. Our engagement measure, and SWOOP measures engagement by people-to-people engagement. So it's not engagement with content. It's not like pushing a like or anything like that. It's actually interacting with somebody else, another human being. And our two measures here were the two-way measures. In other words, if I post something, you reply, and you post something and I reply, then we have a reciprocated two-way relationship. So we measure the percentage of relationships that are reciprocated. We also measure we have a thing called the mention index, which is the percentage of posts and replies that tag somebody else in. And we see that's part of an engagement measure as well. On the innovation side, we have two measures. One is curiosity, which is the percentage of messages that are framed as questions, and it's because they have a question mark at the end of the text. And the last one is diversity. In this case, it's not diversity, gender diversity, it's diversity of experience. So we measure how many other teams people, the members of your team, also active in. So if you're active in multiple teams, then we see that you've got a diversity of experience compared to somebody who's only in one team and only active in one team. Now you'll see that there's lines, dots here. That's actually the range of the minimum to the maximum. So you can see here that, and the red dot is the average. So you can see with Yammer, the range isn't particularly big. The average sort of did go up 70%, but the engagement scores also went up a little bit, except for the mentions, which sort of actually went down a little bit. So you can see Yammer, it's sort of a rise, and things generally rose. But in teams, this is where the big story is. There's a huge range. So this is the same scale, remember. So look at the difference in the participation rate and users. So when we say 210%, 10%, some of them probably were, well, I think I can look at that number. Some of them were 270% or whatever. I think, no, that's the users. Sorry, that's not the activity. So this is just the number of users. So there was a rise of 270% in the actual number of users, not the activity, the actual number of users. So compared to some down that hardly moved at all, right? So big range in participation. The interesting part of this story is the engagement and the innovation, and they both went backwards, right? So, and that's probably understandable because a lot of these new people coming in to participate really have no idea how to engage with others on the platform. So it's telling that same immaturity sort of picture that we had overall in the report, that there's a lot more people now. So a lot of that 60% that teams that were hardly being used, they've probably now got people in them doing stuff, but they're not understanding how to engage properly yet. So the difference between February, where we had teams that have started to learn how to engage, to this mass of people that have come into teams in March because of the COVID situation, it's just flooded the rest of them. Some of these teams that might have only had 10 fairly well engaged sort of people, all of a sudden grow to 70 people. And those other 50 have no real idea of what they should be doing to engage with the rest of the team members. So we're seeing right now this drop in engagement and in innovation in the team space in particular. Not so much the case in Yammer. In fact, you can see the curiosity has actually gone up quite a bit, as you'd expect on the Yammer platform, because people are asking the organisation, what's happening? What are we going to do? We're going to work from home or still stay in the office? In that March period, that was the conversation that was happening. So we're going to study this a lot more, and we'll talk about that a little bit at the end of the talk. But briefly, I said before that setting up your teams that align with your current sort of in the office structure, if you like, is not always a bad thing. In fact, it's a low risk thing to do. And if you're just after efficiency, you've got your digital teams mimicking your in the office team, you're wanting tools to make that happen a little bit faster, I guess it can work for that. But I think what our consultants and a lot of the consultants are saying, this is a very modest sort of use of teams. Now I've got here that, if you want to be more agile, you might choose to set up some teams that go across the organisation, especially the project teams or the teams that are developing new stuff for the organisation. So that's sort of like, well, let's keep the business as usual teams going in a digital space, but let's create a project organisation that's much more fluid and agile. So that's sort of like the halfway house. And of course, the transformation is when you just start again. And I think really what we're seeing with the pandemic is that many organisations are starting to look at that agility and transformation now for teams, more so than just the safe, if you like, increased efficiency through the digital tools. Now, the other thing that I want to get to, and move on a little bit faster now, is that in our Yammer report, which was late last year, we started sort of reporting on culture, and I'd introduced this culture mapping process that we designed based on a thing called the competitive values framework. And in that report, we built a culture map for the organisations based on how they were interacting, and we found that, and then I also surveyed the organisations, and typically with a culture survey, you ask people questions. What do they think your culture is according to certain dimensions? They also ask them what would they like it to be, and they look at the delta and they work on that. So I pretty much did that. But what we found was that the Yammer culture map was very much more aligned with what people said they'd like their culture to be, rather than what it currently was. Interesting, and that's the blue. On the blue, and I know it's a little bit small, you can see it in the report if you download it, but the red is actually the equivalent of Teams. So we've got 5 organisations here that have been using Teams and Yammer together, right? And usually for a reasonable time. I think all of them have been using it for at least a year, if not longer. And you can see that the shape of the Teams culture map is much more towards the hierarchy and the business as usual stuff. So what we're seeing here is really 2 different cultural spaces sort of represented by Teams and Yammer. Now, just to reinforce this, we looked at a few of our clients, and we said, let's plot, how many teams cross the organisational boundary, through their interactions. So if I'm interacting with you and you're in a different business unit, that will form a line between my business unit and your business unit. In Yammer, that's the actual chart you're seeing on the right-hand side. So a rich interconnection of the departments. But within Teams, as I said in an earlier comment, the one I stalled on a little bit, was that, very few of the interactions actually cross the formal business unit boundary in Teams. Most of the teams work inside their business units. And I think this is important because those of you that have studied culture at all would have come across a guy called John Cotter from Harvard. He wrote the book on cultural change in the 1990s. In 2014, he published this model he called the dual operating system. And basically what he's saying is that, we can't really achieve this single culture. In fact, we need 2 cultures. We need one that's focused on the here and now, which is more aligned with the hierarchy. And we need one that's focused on the future, and that's more the innovation and the network, if you like. And I think that's what we're starting to see, the separation in Yammer and Teams. And I think Sharon will go on, give you some tangible example of that. So I'm going to pass over to Sharon now to talk you through a case study well, it's over to you, Sharon. You can talk about the
Thank
client.
you, Laurie. Hi, everyone. So Laurie touched on best practices in teams, and what I wanted to show you was what a best practice team looks like. So we know that this team that I'm going to tell you about, it was one of the top performers. It was in the top 10 of the 5,300 teams that we benchmarked. And again, the idea is just to show you a really practical example of what can work in teams. So this is a company, it's called Real Foundations. It's actually a global professional real estate services company, which is not just managing real estate and selling houses, but it's about like developments, right down to managing. They do everything from real estate globally. And in Dallas, Texas, we've got this lovely lady, Naomi Souza, who is the Director of Presence and Assets. But most of her team is actually based in Chennai in India. So she has a couple of team members in Dallas and the rest of them are in India. So each day, every person within her team, it's quite a large team in that it's 15 people. So Laurie's other research will show that probably a best practice team would be under 10 people. But I'm sure you guys are seeing that there's lots of teams that have a lot more than 10 people in it. So this is only some of her team members in this picture. Each person starts their day with a post of what I'm doing today, and then they'll finish their day, just explaining what they've completed for the day. So when Naomi wakes up in Dallas every morning, she knows exactly what every team member has been working on, and she knows how to be able to manage the whole team. So that's one way that they are just having complete transparency on what every team member's doing. They are using it as a repository so that all the information that they do is stored on Teams, and it's somewhere where they can go back once a project's completed. If they need to find out any information, they know that it will always be in that team or in that channel. So Laurie touched earlier on the 5 different team personas that we have, and that's one thing that we do at SWOOP is we've classified teams into different personas. The reason we've done that is to be able to give nudges and tips on how to move into a different sort of a team persona if you wanted to. So I'd like a pop quiz for all you guys in the chat, if you wouldn't mind. Can you take a punt and let me know, what sort of team do you think Naomi's team is? Is it a self-directed team, single leader, a community of practice, a forum, or a disconnected team? And Laurie, I'm just going to jump over to you. Can you just quickly go through the explanation of what these team types are, please?
Okay, so I did speak a little bit about, well, I'll tell you how we measured them, right? So the self-directed team, it's pretty clear that you see that one person is in the center of the sort of network map. So they're sort of calling the tune. With a self-directed team, we'll see that many of the members are connected with each other, not necessarily with a single leader, but with each other. And more often than not, they're connected in reciprocal relationships. So when we look at and Emily will show you an example of that graphically later on, but we'll see a map where there's a lot of what we call red lines or interconnected lines. That's the self-directed team. The community itself is like a self-directed team with a gallery, right? So the self-directed team is actually a core that's facilitating the community, and the gallery are people that wanting to learn from that core. The actual forum is like a single leader team, but with a big gallery that's just there to listen, basically. Sometimes there's a bit of Q&A, but mostly it's about, a message being transmitted to a large group of people. It's a forum with some element of Q&A. And the last one is disconnected. Now really they're not really active enough to us to characterize another persona, but what we do see in those very low activity teams is there's very few connections, and virtually no reciprocated connections. So largely, if you're a disconnected team, you just need to do more, so.
Well, the brownie points go to Daryl. He was the first in to get it right for a self-directed team. And what we would usually say is that's probably the most aspirational team, depending what you want to achieve out of each team. But if you want that transparency where everyone's working well as a team, a self-directed team is what you would aspire to. So points to Daryl. Chris, we got Peter Lee got it right. We've got quite a lot there. So, oh yes, Daryl, first place. I love that. So as we spoke about, Naomi's team, which we're calling What I'm Doing Today, is 15 team members. And again, the reason we know that this is such a best practice team is because of all the measures that Laurie spoke about earlier that they scored really high on. But another point that we want to talk about here, Laurie touched on it earlier, and I bet you guys come across this a lot. Again, I'd love to hear your stories in the chat if you've got a chance to put it in there. But who has the issue of when do you use Teams, when do you use Yammer, and why do you need both? And Naomi said that it was something that they encountered when they first used Teams, because they were actually using Yammer for a lot of work. And then they switched into Teams and people were asking why do we need both and when do we use what? But it became really clear quite quickly for them. Now, just to put it in perspective, Real Foundations has been one of our most mature networks on both our Yammer benchmarking, and they were the early adopters of Teams in March 2017, so some of the first in the world to start using it. But Teams is where they go to work to do their day-to-day work. So Teams is the place where you're working with the people that you know. It's a defined group of people, it's your team, and it's where you get your work done day to day. But often you're going to go encounter an issue or something that's happened where you need to find the answer to something that people within your team don't know. And that's when you move to Yammer. So Yammer's where you might go and ask a question, or you've your team's achieved something or found some knowledge that you can share with the rest of the enterprise, and others can learn from it. So that's when you would move to Yammer. Naomi describes Yammer as the virtual water cooler. So the sort of thing, if you were going to go into the lunchroom and run into people from other teams, that's the sort of place where you would be on Yammer, and you can have those sorts of interactions on Yammer. So, oh, here we go. We're jumping into the competition code. Actually, I'm going to do this. Grab your phones and scan this, and this can give everybody a chance to join the competition, which I don't know what the prizes are. Do you know, Emily?
I'm not sure. I think it's a bit of a mystery.
All right, I'm going in.
I can tell you there's lots of different prizes. There's headsets, there's Busy Lights, there's JB Hi-Fi and Amazon vouchers, and a whole bunch of different things.
Oh, good. My son would be stealing the JB Hi-Fi for gaming, I'm sure.
All right. Filling it in.
We got that one in then. Yep. Will we move on? Oh, yes. So this is actually a screenshot of the SWOOP dashboard of Naomi's team. So I'm going to hand over to Emily now, and she will explain, what the measures are. There we go, switching screens. What the measures are that we can see that this is such a high-performing team.
Fantastic. Thanks, Sharon. So this is how Naomi's actual team is coming to life in a SWOOP dashboard. So at the moment, we're looking at anonymized data from Naomi's team, but it is presenting to you exactly what she would be seeing if she was logging into SWOOP. So, of course, we're looking at things at the top, like obviously the key statistics. And I'm not sure if we've mentioned already around optimal team size. So you'll notice that Naomi's team is just slightly a little bit bigger than what we would anticipate.
Well, we
doing a really good job. Sorry?
You just dropped out for a little second there, Emily. So.
Oh, okay. I'll turn off. One moment. Just yell out again if that does happen. Of course, we did talk about the team personas just earlier and thinking about what Naomi's team could be. And you'll see here, obviously, we've identified them as a self-directed team. And if we look at the measures below, we can see how this all comes into play. So obviously there's very low key player dependency. So the workload is definitely spread across all 14 members of this team. Interdependency is quite high, and there's high reciprocity, which you'll be able to see here in the percent of two-way relationships. And also 100% of this team is a part of the core. So they're all participating, and the spread of that participation is very even, and also a very low percentage of the gallery here. So there's largely quite a low level of inactive members of the team. And you can also see here visually quite well by looking at their team network map. I can also show the names because this is all anonymous. That's fine. They might not even show. No problem if they don't. But you can see here represented by the red lines, you will see that that indicates a two-way relationship, and obviously the thicker the line, the higher the frequency of those interactions as well. And we can move this strength measure across to show where some of those stronger connections are. But because this is a self-directed team, it's, the leadership can quite easily move depending on the changing context. So everyone seems to be connecting quite well, even when we do move a little bit further out. Of course, as well, when we're looking at the interactive users, the level is quite high there. There's very few, again, who are not active. But this is also quite an interesting one here in terms of the response rate. And I think it might have even appeared as slightly higher in the screenshot that we had in the slides around the proportion of posts that are receiving responses and likes or some form of collaboration. And then the level of posts that are not receiving any post or reply is quite low. And, they're performing in quite an agile way as well. So typically the responses are coming through within 1 hour, if not within the day. And if they're working across those different time zones, you would anticipate that would be the case. But very few of those conversations are being picked up on beyond that 24-hour period. So they're moving very quickly. Of course, they're also able to see their most active channels. So they can also see the split across this entire team, and if they're giving a bit of love to all of the channels that are happening there. And of course, very quickly, you can see the key play dependencies, some of those teaming champions as a part of this particular team. But that might also be quite interesting to look at on the enterprise level. So at the moment, I'm in the Teams tab, and I'm just going to navigate over into the Enterprise tab, which is going to give you that org-wide understanding of how Teams is being adopted within the organization. So of course you've got, your top level statistics there again around the membership and how much posting, replying, liking, @mentioning is going on overall. But then when we move a little bit further down, we can also understand, cross-enterprise collaboration and what parts of the organization seem to be talking together in Teams. And we looked at one of those maps before when Laurie was comparing the cross-enterprise collaboration on Yammer versus Teams. So then when we move across, we can also, there's some locations showing up here versus some departments, but you kind of get the picture. For any of these thicker lines, that's representing more interaction, of course, as indicated by the key down the bottom. But then you might also be able to identify some opportunities or gaps in the organization for some parts to be talking. So IT and services don't necessarily aren't necessarily having a heap of conversation going on at the moment. Back office support and finance, and you can also use your own discretion to see if those particular departments or locations need to be having conversations as well. Teaming champions was what I was talking about before. So if you're looking at your organizational wide, who are the people that have adopted Teams quite well, this is where we look at those key influences across the entire instance. And the way that we look at those teaming champions is through the lens of their diversity score, their individual diversity score, and also their total number of interactions. So the diversity index is about how their spread of interactions across the teams that they're currently a member of. So if you're a member of 5 different teams and you're consistently and evenly active across those 5 teams, then you'll have a very high diversity index. If you're a member of 20 different teams and you're only really active in one of those teams, then I would probably suspect that your diversity score would be quite low. So it's how you can bring your experiences and knowledge from from working as a member of lots of different teams, and how you can bring that to your direct team as well. So we're still looking at obviously we can see the most active business segments as well in your organization. So you can very quickly, for example, identify those best practice case study examples, similar to the way we looked at Naomi's team, for example, within your organization as well, whether you're looking at that on a department level. So obviously head office and operations, they seem to have jumped on board with Teams quite well. And you can flip these lists around as well and potentially identify the parts of the organization that maybe haven't gotten on board as quickly as other parts. And maybe you need to have those conversations around the which tool when, and to really demonstrate the value of Teams and being able to, collaborate and have more of that high productivity going on, especially in the circumstances that we're working in at the moment as well. And you can even deep dive down to the most active teams in your organization. So what's new in HQ, it might be interesting to see the way that they are leveraging Teams and the types of conversations that they're having to maybe present to those that haven't quite gotten on board yet. And then, of course, I just need to quickly navigate into the personal tab here. Whenever you log into your Teams dashboard, the first tab it will take you to is to your personal tab. And I know before we spoke a lot, we spoke to some of those worst practices, and one of those was relying on, senior leadership to lead a lot of those best practice behaviors. But in reality, obviously, we would be looking at more of those grassroots approach to adoption with Teams. Change starts at the individual, and that's why the personal dashboard is so important for you to understand the way that you're collaborating as an individual. So we do also have, while we've talked about some of those team personas, we also allocate a SWOOP persona to every single individual in the organization. And that is based on the balance of their interactions as well. So to what extent are they doing the posting versus replying versus liking versus @mentioning, and also the quantity, how many messages are they putting out there as well. You can see also the people that you're connecting with on a regular basis here. So we saw the team network map before, but you can also see how that map will come to life for you at a personal level. and also that you can kind of zoom in and see the people that you are interacting with on a more regular basis too. And, you know, even getting more of an understanding of your own cross-organizational collaboration by having a look at the color of the halos that are hovering over the people's heads as well. So, you know, are you talking to people across lots of different departments, or are you kind of sticking to your own team or your own location? Oh, that went a little bit crazy there, but you get the idea of what's happening there. And of course, your own personal most active teams too. We looked at that on the teams level, the enterprise level, and now this is the personal level. And that's based on your own the number of interactions that you're putting there. Maybe this will make you think a little bit more about your own personal diversity as well. So we looked at that diversity index in terms of your teaming champions. So what would this look like for you on an individual level? Are you active across all of the teams that you're a part of? Are you only active in a few, for example? And what's the quantity of those interactions that are happening there too? And just a few more things I'll call out. We've got the curiosity index here, which is about the proportion of messages where you are asking a question. And you can also see the impact of asking a question on your network. You might see a larger gap than what you're seeing in this demo instance at the moment. But you can also compare how you might be traveling compared to the rest of your organization too. And asking questions is, of course, a fantastic way to drive more collaboration on your posts. Same goes for at mentioning, but you know, we also get to a point in teams sometimes where you suffer from that at mention overload. So what is you might need to think about the at mention sweet spot for your own personal collaboration, and also the way your organization engages as a whole on teams. Laurie, do you have anything else to add in terms of any other key call outs in what we're seeing at the moment?
No, I think you've covered it pretty well, Emily. So
okay, thank you. I'll let me just unshare, and then Laurie, if you just want to reshare slide.
Yeah, are we all back online, or? Oh, I
think we're all here. Sorry, Sharon. I think you're about to call out a few of the questions and things that came through, but maybe we'll just run through a few of those at the end.
Just go to the questions. So, I mean, I might just say quickly that we also have personal analytics in the report. So looking at that personal tab, and we have a section around collaborative overload. So if you're feeling like you're overloaded collaboratively, have a read of that part of the report, and we can certainly measure that. So, but I want to leave some time to, Emily, you can speak to this.
Emily and Laurie, sorry, my computer just cut out there. But Emily, as you were speaking, there was quite a lot of discussion going on in the chats.
Yes, I can see.
Yeah, so I thought maybe we can, well, actually, do you want to just go through this 2-week free trial, and then we could start to answer these questions?
Yes, of course. So for SWOOP, we are offering 2-week free trials if you're interested in analytics for Microsoft Teams or Yammer. So you can be able to have a look around at some of your own data. It'll probably be a little bit more compelling than looking at just the demo data that we're able to look at today. So we also have that on offer. And if you're interested, just feel free to get in contact via our website.
Yep. So Laurie, let's start with David's question. So there's a lot of discussion going on in the chat about Yammer and Teams. David, do you want to jump in here, and you could ask your question just about why you're saying you don't understand why we can't have teams dedicated to Yammer like topics. There's too many tools, and there's a definite overlap between the core benefits of Teams and Yammer. I see Teams swallowing Yammer up in the future. Did you want to jump in, David, to ask Laurie anything more?
No, I think that's kind of how I'm thinking about it, because I do think that it's confusing to users. It's a big step to move from the inbox, to another tool, and it just I think the benefits of collaborating in teams are very obvious, and then the social aspects of Yammer, it just seems like that would be a natural kind of migration into Teams down the road, and maybe relieve some of the end user training and adoption that might come from that. So that was it. Just
I think
I've never quite got.
I think you're not alone on that, and what we would say is that the organisations, those 5 organisations that have been using Teams and Yammer together for more than 12 months don't appear to have that issue. So all we can say is that they are, and I think our measurements are showing that there actually are different cultural spaces. In fact, one of our clients was reflecting on his own personal use of both of them, and they were using both tools. And he said that, you know, when he goes to Yammer, he's in a different mind space. He's in more of his expansive mind space. You know, it's like walking to the water cooler. He said if that community was just another team in Teams, it wouldn't feel the same. It just wouldn't feel like he was actually leaving his day-to-day work to think about something more broadly. So I think basically the people that are used to using both tools don't appear to have that confusion. And in fact, what you'll find is that the Yammer is soon not going to be just a tab. It's actually going to be added to the left-hand side of Teams. I think we might even be seeing that now. I'm not sure, but I saw somebody showing it the other day, and it was and communities will come up on your left-hand side of Teams. So it's even Microsoft is supporting that separation, and not because they've got two tools. I think it is a different mindset, working in a community and working in a team. So I think it's important to have both, and we certainly promote that. So we understand the issues because we heard from people just like you all the time. But all I can say is the people that are using both of those tools fairly heavily don't appear to have that confusion now. They did to start with, though, I'd have to say, but most of them now are saying we know what we're doing now.
Laurie, I'm just conscious of time, so I'm just going to jump in with John's question about where we store the data in SWOOP.
Okay, so I did say that it was, it's only, we don't store any messages or names. We only store metadata, and they're stored on Azure in clusters in Australia, Europe, and the United States. Sort of, I can't tell you exactly where, but and I think there might be a couple in Europe. So so largely it's all Azure. It's all within the Microsoft ecosystem. We do run sentiment analysis as well through to Microsoft Cognitive Services, but even that data is sent from your client side to Microsoft and back, and all we get is the score and a message ID. So, and then when we send that data back to you, the actual connection to your data, your names and your messages happens on your side of the firewall. So SWOOP never sees that, and we don't store it. So that all happens. It's connected, if you understand browser level APIs, it uses that technique to reconnect the ID numbers back to your context, your messages and your people's names and so forth. So you saw it with Emily, there was a little bit of a delay when there was the pictures were coming up on the network map, because the software was actually going out to the directory and getting that information from the browser, if you like. So.
Thanks, Laurie. Laurie, could you just jump to the next slide, please? Because we've had some questions asking how we can get, that's for the benchmarking report. And on our website, you'll be able to access the free trial as well. And anyone who wants to access it, Emily will just set you up with that as well. So you can send us a message here, jump onto the website, and there's a form, just your name and your email, and Emily will be in touch. Brett, I don't know whether you're still on the call, but this is from Brett Williams, and he's just asking, and welcome to ask this, jump in anytime, Brett. Is there any data or experience to determine if implementing a collaboration agreement helps adoption to Teams? By collaboration agreement, I mean we commit to posting to Teams. We won't share attachments rather than links. We'll check in regularly, etc.
Yeah, hi Sharon. All.
Hi, Brett.
Thanks for mentioning that. I actually got that. So a while ago where I worked, I'm in the ATO, but I still work there, but I've moved teams a few times, and I did adopt a collaboration agreement. I actually stole it from Lorian, who posted one of those, way back. And, it certainly found value in the team I was working at the time, but we were like a team, the intranet team, piloting the use of Teams, working with Teams, and obviously well ahead of the rest of the organisation. We've just rolled it out, we've rolled it out to the organisation predominantly just as a chat and keeping connected tool for the moment during the COVID-19 stitch. But I'm just sort of trying to wonder within the team where I am now whether that sort of thing might help, people adopt and sort of start to slowly change that culture.
Yeah, I think it happens right at the team level. So one of our partners, Adopt and Embrace, have written a wonderful book on Teams, and one of the things they say in there, which is very important, is that the teams themselves agree to a certain norm of communication. In other words, this is how we're going to connect with each other. This is how much we're going to use chat versus putting stuff in the threaded discussion area. This is how we're going to use mentions. In other words, I'm only going to mention people if I want you to act on something. I'm not going to just flood you with mentions just because you're there and all that sort of stuff. So the collaboration agreement made within a team is basically a norm that the team agrees to. Now, that's much easier to do when you're a team, a self-directed team or a single leader team. It's not that easy to do if you're a forum or a community. So as I said, that works well at the real team level, but when you're at those bigger teams, yeah, maybe you need something more enterprise-wide, and we have no sort of feedback on whether any sort of policies that have been generated at an enterprise level actually have any impact. My sense is probably not, because what we're hearing is leadership pronouncements don't seem to have a big impact on Teams use, and in fact, the leaders themselves are probably not great users of Teams themselves, whereas they tend to be much better on Yammer. So I would suggest that sort of agreement within the team is where it's most effective in terms of adoption, and certainly a recommended practice by Adopt and Embrace. And Paul Woods, I think, is the leader.
That's the book you're referring to. So John, I'll put the link into Adopt and Embrace's book on Teams in the chat as well. Victoria, I don't know if you're still around, because I know a lot of people are going off to the next session, and I'm sorry that we are going over time. But Victoria, did you want to jump in? You've got some really interesting discussion, and I think it's great for the diversity side of things. She's just commenting that not all organisations use Yammer, particularly smaller organisations might choose to use Teams only. Could pick the tool that works best for the business, or let the business units decide the ones that will work for them without dictating. What do you think about that, Laurie? Or jump in, Victoria. It's the tools are there, and use what you want to use without being told this is what you have to use.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, Victoria here. So I think it just really does depend on the size of the organisation, because it can get confusing, and I think some organisations like to be a bit more dictatorial, as you mentioned before, where maybe the IT department has decided we're going to use this and not this. But I think what does work with a lot of organisations is that they've let their business units decide the tool that works best for their little unit. But I think in a large organisation, to break it so that Yammer is for that outer loop, as someone mentioned here on our chat, and Teams been for those work groups, and Teams been for those little projects, because the intention really was for Teams to be a collaboration tool for work groups, to really be that hub to get their day-to-day work done. And I don't know, Teams for setting up one team for a large, thousands of members, I don't see that working, but that's just my view. Thanks.
Yeah, I actually share that view, but people are doing it, and as I said, I think the earlier comment you made about, let the business and the people decide, I think is probably the right approach. We've seen some quite small organisations and consulting companies, less than 100 people, quite actively using both tools. So they in their mind have worked it out. I mean, Adopt and Embrace, in fact, use both tools. They've only got less than 20 people. I think there might even be only 15 people. They're all remote, they're all working remotely. But they actually use both tools. So I don't know that the size of the organisation matters that much, but it certainly, I have a view that the business needs to drive the tool use, not IT, and that certainly came through in our worst practices. Left to their own, IT will limit what functionality you have, and we've seen that. Our partners have seen Teams implementations with half the functions turned off. So it's not even Teams, sort of from their perspective. And I think they've been turned off because nobody from the business has said, hold on a minute, or even the people from the business might not even known. They said, well, hold on a minute, we actually want to use that external Teams function, and we can justify using it, and if there's a risk, we think the benefit's more than the risk. And in my view, that discussion hasn't been had by a lot of organisations that have just, and some of our partners said when they've asked their clients why certain functions have been turned off, they've just sort of said, we don't know. You know, that's just what IT have done. You know, it's never even been challenged. It was sort of like, well, and some of these functions were incredibly important to their productivity. It was just sort of like, well, I think in a smaller organisation, it's easier to have that discussion. In very large organisations, you know, the IT is a bit of a cathedral, and it's sort of like, you know, you've got to go through umpteen different places to talk to somebody that might be able to change something. But I think, you know, there's opportunity on both sides of the IT divide to sort of engage around teams and have a more productive discussion.
Laurie, do you want to move to your next slide and just, if anyone who's left, just to share what offer we've got?
Yeah, I mean, this is, I guess it's a tentative offer because we don't necessarily want to get overloaded, but, you know, for me as a scientist sort of who studied virtual working for probably a couple of decades and been tracking it with analytics for at least that long, the ability to have a situation, a controlled experiment where you've asked everybody to work from home for a few months is a once in a lifetime, I think. So we see this as a real opportunity, not just to sort of promote what SWOOP does, but to actually understand how people actually can work virtually or not. You know, so right now we're in a situation where people are forced to work virtually. So we're wanting to measure what's happening. We've already measured, as you've seen on the slides, people coming into this sort of work from home environment. We want to measure how they sort of survive that, how they move out of that. And even if they go back to whatever that new normal is, what does that look like? Are they actually performing better than what they were before they went in and what have you? We don't know. This is actually a pure research interest type thing. But we think that we can help organisations really slingshot back into a better new normal by identifying those teams that I would say are most exposed. That means that, you know, in March we've seen them jump from nearly no activity to a heap of activity. They're the 200 or 300%ers, and monitor them over a period of time to see in both Yammer and Teams or either, and see, you know, how well they start to engage over time or not, you know. And if we can find teams that really have been able to accelerate their collaboration performance, we want to understand. So we'll use our same benchmarking techniques. We want to talk to them. We want to understand, you know, what is it that seems to be working for them. And then we want to help those organisations share what they're finding within their organisations, but also hopefully allow us to share that more globally. So if you like, we're also ramping up our teams benchmarking to be very, very focused on a number of high-performing teams. And so if you're in that situation and you think that you're reach out to us. I can't guarantee that we can take you on because we're getting a lot of interest in this, obviously. But, you know, if you have that situation, you're using Yammer and Teams in particular, we want to look at both because we want to see the difference in the dynamics for Yammer and Teams. So we would probably prioritise organisations that are using both. And reach out to me on email if you like. That's there, and let's have a discussion and see whether we can accommodate you. So I think that's it from us. Okay,
sorry, Lawrence, I was just Lorian jumped out as your production because he had a call, and I sort of switched back in. So sorry to trick you. Megan from the planning team. Did you have any? Sorry, were you about to finish up any further comments before we stop the recording?
No, I think we're done. We're done. So thank everybody for attending, and well, I guess.
Thank you. That was fantastic. Really, really interesting. And I'm going to make sure we get these uploaded rapidly as well. So today and tomorrow we'll have the uploads available on the website over the weekend. And as we move through next week, we'll be getting them done at the end of each day. So thanks everyone for participating. Thank you for our fantastic presenters.
And thank you for hosting. It's a huge effort.
You're welcome. You're welcome.
Thank you.